Tonight, you're about to discover an ancient secret that spiritual gardeners have cultivated for thousands of years, a way to transform the restless mind into the fertile ground of profound peace. I'm going to share timeless stories from those who learn to tend the garden of consciousness, nurturing rest not through force, but through the gentle wisdom of working with nature's rhythms. Within each tale lies a seed of transformation, one that awakens your soul's forgotten ability to release every burden, every worry, every fragment of the day that keeps you from the deep rest you deserve. These stories come from gardens both literal and metaphorical, where ancient wisdom keepers discovered that the most beautiful growth happens not through rigid control, but through patient, loving attention. Here's what sets this journey apart from ordinary sleep meditations. These teachings work even if you've never meditated before. Even if your mind feels like an overgrown garden, tangled with the day's concerns. Even if you've tried everything else and peaceful sleep still feels elusive. As the garden masters knew, peace grows not from force, but from the fertile silence of letting go. As we walk together through moonlit paths and discover hidden groves of wisdom, something remarkable will begin to happen. Your mental soil will start to soften. The seeds of worry will lose their grip, and you'll find yourself naturally settling into a state of profound rest that you may have forgotten was your birthright. So make yourself comfortable now. Adjust your position until it feels just right, like finding the perfect spot in a garden where you could sit for hours. Let your body sink into your bed, surrendering completely to its support. Take one deep breath with me now, breathing in the night air. And as you exhale, imagine you're standing before an ancient garden gate, worn smooth by countless hands, ready to open onto paths of wisdom that have been waiting for you since the beginning of time. The gate creaks softly as it swings open. Step through now, leaving the busy world behind, entering a space where time moves like honey and wisdom grows in the gentle darkness. Chapter 1: The Overgrown Garden. Let's begin our journey with the first garden we encounter, where moonlight filters through branches heavy with the day's growth. This is the story of the overgrown garden, and it speaks to the art of tending without forcing. In the mountains of ancient Korea, there lived a young gardener named Min-jun, who had inherited his family's legendary garden. Determined to make it more perfect than ever before, he worked from sunrise to sunset, trimming every branch to precise angles, measuring flower spacing with a wooden ruler, and pulling every wild plant that dared grow where he hadn't planted it. When spring rains brought unexpected growth, Min-jun worked frantically to contain it. Wild morning glories climbing his trellises were torn down. Moss softening his stone paths was scraped away. The garden looked impressive, every line sharp, every plant obedient. But Min-jun was exhausted, his hands trembling from overwork, lying awake at night, worrying about imperfections. One autumn morning, as he knelt measuring chrysanthemum heights, an elderly woman appeared at his gate. Her clothes were simple, her eyes deep with wisdom. "I'm a traveling gardener," she said gently. "Might I rest and share some tea?" Despite his irritation at the interruption, Min-jun couldn't refuse. As they sat on his perfectly arranged bench, she asked, "Are you happy here?" The question startled him. "I'm preserving my family's legacy," he replied stiffly. "This garden must be perfect." She pointed to a corner where a wild grapevine had climbed through bamboo fencing, purple flowers dotting its length, butterflies dancing around its leaves. "And what of that corner?" "That's tomorrow's project," Minjun said tightly. "The vine doesn't belong there." "Ah, but the butterflies seem to disagree." More butterflies appeared, their wings catching sunlight like stained glass, creating patterns of beauty his careful design had never achieved. "I've seen gardens like yours," the woman continued, "beautiful in their precision. But I've also seen another kind, where the gardener works with the land's wisdom rather than against it. She taught him to look with his heart instead of his judging mind. The vine's tendrils curved in perfect spirals. The butterflies moved in patterns of natural grace, cultivated bamboo and wild grape, creating harmony more beautiful than either could achieve alone. The secret," she said, "is not to eliminate the wild, but to dance with it." Over the following days, she taught Minjun to guide rather than force, to work with natural rhythms rather than against them. Our path winds deeper into the garden, where the gentle sound of water calls us toward our next teaching. In a mountain monastery known for its contemplative beauty, there stood a fountain that had been the heart of the community for 3 centuries. Its crystalline water once danced in sunlight, creating music that accompanied the monks' prayers and meditations. But one spring morning, the fountain fell silent, its basin dry, its carved dragons no longer weeping streams of clarity. The abbot was deeply troubled. This fountain wasn't merely decoration. It was the monastery's spiritual center, where novices took their vows and masters found inspiration. He called upon the community's most industrious monks to restore the flow. Brother Chen, known for his mechanical skills, arrived with an elaborate hand pump. He worked furiously for days, sweat beading on his forehead as he forced air through the system. The fountain sputtered briefly, then fell silent again. Brother Yuki brought complex copper pipes and metal fittings, creating an intricate network that looked impressive but produced only occasional drops. The more elaborate his system became, the less water flowed. Brother Dao organized the entire community into ritual circles around the fountain, chanting prayers and burning incense, believing divine intervention would restore the flow. The ceremonies grew longer and more elaborate, but the basin remained empty. Weeks passed. The monks' efforts intensified, their frustration mounting with each failed attempt. The monastery filled with the noise of hammering, the smoke of incense, the strain of increasingly desperate activity. Finally, young Sister Lin, newest to the community, approached the abbot quietly. "Master," she said, "might I suggest something?" "Of course, child. We've tried everything else. What if we simply remove what's blocking the spring?" The seasoned monks looked skeptical. Where was the complex solution, the dramatic intervention? But Sister Lin led them behind the fountain to where the natural spring emerged from the mountainside. There, accumulated leaves, silt, and debris had formed a dam over months of neglect. Working together with simple tools, their hands, wooden scoops, basic brushes, they gently cleared away the obstruction. Within minutes, clear water began trickling, then flowing, then dancing again in the fountain basin. The ancient music returned, more beautiful for having been missed. The abbot smiled. We spent weeks trying to force water where it couldn't flow, when we needed only to remove what prevented its natural movement. From the garden of awakened senses, our path leads us across a stark landscape where moonlight illuminates an unexpected truth, that in the harshest, most barren places, the most extraordinary beauty often finds a way to bloom. In the Rajasthan desert of India, where endless dunes shifted like golden seas under the blazing sun and mirages danced on the horizon like promises of water that would never come, there lived a botanist named Dr. Priya Sharma, who had dedicated her life to studying how life persists in impossible conditions. She had chosen the most unforgiving environment she could find, a region where temperatures soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, where rain might not fall for years at a time, and where the very sand seemed hostile to any form of growth. Most scientists considered such places lifeless laboratories, interesting only for studying geological processes or extreme weather patterns. But Priya had made a startling discovery. These apparently dead landscapes harbored some of the most resilient and beautiful plant communities on Earth. Species that had evolved extraordinary strategies for not just surviving, but thriving in conditions that would kill most living things within hours. Her research station was a small concrete building surrounded by what appeared to be absolutely nothing, just endless expanses of sand, rock, and baking heat. Visiting colleagues often expressed pity for her isolation and wondered how she could find any meaningful research in such a barren place. They would arrive expecting to spend a few uncomfortable days documenting the absence of life before returning to more hospitable environments. Dr. Raj Mehta was one such visitor, a prestigious botanist from the University of Delhi, whose specialty was lush rainforest ecosystems. He had come to Rajasthan reluctantly, fulfilling an obligation to review Priya's research for a government grant renewal. As far as he was concerned, the desert represented the opposite of everything that made botany interesting. It was a place where plants went to die, not where they flourished. "I don't understand what you hope to accomplish here," Raj said on his first evening at the research station, gesturing at the endless wasteland visible through the window. "There's nothing here to study. This isn't a garden. It's the absence of gardens." Priya smiled mysteriously. "Come with me tomorrow at dawn. Let me show you something that might change your perspective." The next morning, before the sun had risen high enough to make travel unbearable, Priya led Raj out into what he had assumed was empty desert. As they walked, she began pointing out things his rainforest-trained eyes had missed entirely. Tiny succulents no bigger than coins that could store months' worth of water in their thick leaves. Shrubs that looked dead, but were actually in a state of suspended animation, ready to burst into bloom within hours of receiving moisture. Underground root systems that stretched for hundreds of meters, connecting what appeared to be separate plants into vast, invisible communities. "The mistake," Priya explained, "is thinking that abundance means obvious growth. Desert plants don't waste energy on impressive displays during harsh seasons. They conserve, concentrate, prepare. Their beauty isn't constant, it's perfectly timed." As if to prove her point, they crested a small rise, and Raj gasped in astonishment. Before them stretched a hidden valley, where dozens of desert cacti were in full bloom. The flowers were incredible: bright yellows, deep purples, shocking reds, colors so vivid they seemed to glow against the neutral backdrop of sand and stone. Each blossom was perfect, substantial, clearly designed to make the most of precious pollinating opportunities. "These flowers bloom for just a few days each year," Priya said. "Some only at night, others only after specific rainfall patterns. But when they do bloom, they're more beautiful than anything in your rainforest because their beauty is so rare, so perfectly timed, so distilled." She knelt beside a barrel cactus whose crown was covered in brilliant orange flowers. "This plant spends 360 days a year looking like a lifeless lump. But for 5 days, it becomes one of the most spectacular flowering plants on Earth. The harsh conditions don't prevent its beauty. They concentrate it, intensify it, make it precious." Over the following days, Priya showed Raj plant after plant that had found ways to create extraordinary beauty within seemingly impossible constraints. Desert roses that bloomed in solid rock, resurrection plants that could lose 95% of their water content and appear completely dead, then return to full health within hours of receiving moisture. Night-blooming cereus that saved their entire year's energy for a single night of magnificent flowering. "The rainforest plants have it easy," Priya observed. "Constant moisture, stable temperatures, predictable conditions. They can afford to be wasteful, to bloom constantly, to grow without much strategy. But desert plants must be perfect. Every adaptation must be flawless. Every bloom must count. Every survival strategy must be tested against the ultimate harsh conditions." Raj began to understand that the desert wasn't the absence of life, but a different expression of it. One that had been refined by extremity into something more concentrated and powerful than the abundant, but perhaps superficial growth of easier environments. "The most profound lesson," Priya said as they watched the sun set over the blooming desert, "is that beauty doesn't require ideal conditions. Sometimes the most extraordinary flowering happens precisely because conditions are difficult. The constraints force innovation, creativity, perfect timing." She continued, "In the rainforest, plants compete by growing bigger, faster, showier. In the desert, they compete by becoming more efficient, more resilient, more perfectly adapted. Which do you think produces more interesting solutions to the challenges of existence?" By the end of his stay, Raj had completely revised his understanding of botanical beauty. The desert plant's ability to create spectacular displays from minimal resources, their perfect timing, their resilience, and their concentrated beauty impressed him more than the lush abundance he had always considered superior. When he returned to Delhi, Raj began incorporating desert gardening principles into his own work, discovering that plants grown under slightly stressed conditions often produced more intense colors, stronger root systems, and more concentrated fragrances than those grown in perfect comfort. From the grafted orchard, our path winds toward the sound of gentle water lapping, leading us to a most unusual sight, a garden that floats upon a tranquil lake, teaching us about finding stability in constant motion. In the lakes of Kashmir, where houseboats drifted like painted dreams and mountains reflected in still waters, there lived a gardener named Kamala who faced a challenge unlike any other. Her family had tended floating gardens for 7 generations, cultivating vegetables and flowers on woven mats of reeds and water hyacinth that rose and fell with the lake's changing levels. These floating beds, called rad in the local language, were marvels of adaptation, gardens that could move with floods, adjust to droughts, and produce abundant crops, despite having no fixed connection to solid ground. But Camilla struggled with the constant motion. Unlike the firm earth that most gardeners knew, her garden beds shifted with every wind, bobbed with every passing boat, and changed position throughout each day as currents carried them across the lake's surface. She found herself constantly fighting this movement, using ropes and anchors to try to keep her plots in exactly the same positions, growing frustrated when they refused to stay put. "How can I create anything stable when everything keeps moving?" she complained to her grandmother, Mataji, who watched Camilla's daily battles with patient amusement. "I plant my seeds in careful rows, and by afternoon, the current has shifted everything. I design perfect arrangements, and the wind rearranges them overnight. Other gardeners have solid ground to work with. Why must we struggle with this endless drifting?" Mataji, whose weathered hands had tended floating gardens for over 60 years, listened to these complaints with the wisdom of someone who had learned to dance with uncertainty rather than resist it. "Come," she said one morning, untying her small boat from its mooring. "Let me show you something you have forgotten how to see." They rowed out to where the oldest floating gardens drifted in the lake's center, far from the shore-bound anchors and ropes that Camilla used to restrict her plot's movement. These ancient gardens were larger and more lush than any others, their vegetables robust and their flowers spectacular, despite, or perhaps because of, their complete freedom to move with the lake's rhythms. "Tell me," Mataji said, as they drifted alongside a magnificent floating bed heavy with tomatoes and marigolds. "What do you notice about these plants?" Camilla studied the garden carefully. The plants were indeed more vigorous than those in her anchored plots, their roots deeper and stronger, their stems more flexible. "They seem healthier," she admitted reluctantly. "And why do you think that is?" "I don't know. Maybe the water is better here in the deeper lake." Mataji smiled. "The water is the same, but these gardens receive something yours do not. They get sunlight from all directions as they slowly rotate with the currents. They're naturally irrigated as the lake water seeps up through the reed mats from below. Most importantly, their roots have learned to hold on without being rigid." She continued, "When you anchor your gardens in place, you think you're creating stability, but actually you're creating stress. The plants know the foundation wants to move. It's made of reeds and water, not stone. When you force it to stay still, the plants must expend energy fighting against their floating nature. But when the garden moves freely, the plants can relax into their true environment." Over the following weeks, Mataji taught Camilla the deeper principles of floating garden cultivation. The key wasn't to eliminate movement, but to understand its patterns and work with them. She learned that the garden's slow rotation ensured even sun exposure for all plants. The gentle bobbing motion actually helped aerate the root systems. The changing positions throughout the day and seasons created beneficial variations in water temperature, nutrient access, and growing conditions. A floating garden that cannot move, Mataji explained, is like a bird that cannot fly. You've destroyed its essential nature in trying to make it conform to your expectations. The hardest lesson was learning to plant and tend without attachment to specific arrangements. Kamala had to release her desire for geometric precision and embrace the organic patterns that emerged as the gardens drifted and rotated. She discovered that plants had their own wisdom about spacing and arrangement when allowed to grow in their naturally moving environment. More profoundly, she learned to find her own stability not through controlling the garden's position, but through developing her balance and adaptability as a gardener. Working on constantly shifting surfaces, she became more graceful in her movements, more attentive to subtle changes, more responsive to the moment-by-moment needs of her plants. The secret, Mataji revealed, is learning to rest in motion. Most people think stability means things staying the same. But true stability is the ability to remain centered while everything around you changes. A floating garden teaches this. How to be rooted without being stuck. How to be grounded without being rigid. Within a year, Kamala's floating gardens had transformed. Free to move with the lake's natural currents, they produced more abundant harvests than her anchored plots ever had. More importantly, she had transformed too. The constant, gentle motion that had once frustrated her now soothed her, like being rocked by a giant cradle. She began to understand that the floating gardens were a perfect metaphor for life itself. Everything was always in motion. Thoughts, emotions, circumstances, relationships. The suffering came not from the movement, but from the resistance to it. Peace was found not by making everything stop, but by learning to flow gracefully with the changes. Visitors to the lake would often ask Kamala the secret of her beautiful floating gardens. She would gesture to the gently bobbing beds around her and say simply, "Learn to rest in motion." Trust that stability comes not from refusing to move, but from moving in harmony with the greater currents. Following the fountain's gentle song, we arrive at a moonlit clearing where different flowers reveal their secrets in the darkness. In the hills of ancient Persia, there lived a gardener named Reza who took immense pride in his daylight garden. Every morning at sunrise, he would walk his carefully planned paths, admiring the brilliant roses, the cheerful marigolds, and the proud sunflowers that turned their faces toward the light. His garden was famous throughout the region for its spectacular daytime display. Reza worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, watering, pruning, and fertilizing, always focused on making his daylight flowers more vibrant and more impressive. As evening approached and shadows lengthened, he would retreat indoors, exhausted from his labors, never giving a thought to his garden in darkness. "Night is for resting," he would tell visitors. "My garden's beauty belongs to the day." One summer evening, Reza's young nephew came to visit from a distant city. As they finished dinner, the boy asked, "Uncle, might we walk in your garden by moonlight? I've heard gardens hold different magic after sunset." Reza waved dismissively. "There's nothing to see out there in the dark. You'll appreciate it properly in the morning." But the curious child slipped out later while his uncle slept. What he discovered took his breath away. In the silvery moonlight, an entirely different garden had awakened. Pale night-blooming jasmine released an intoxicating fragrance. The queen of the night Sirius opened massive white flowers that would close forever at dawn's first light. Evening primrose glowed like scattered stars along the pathways. Most magical of all, the night garden attracted creatures Razor had never seen: lunar moths with wings like jade silk, night-blooming orchids that seemed to whisper secrets, and a peace so profound it made the boy's heart sing. The next morning, he excitedly described the nocturnal wonderland to his uncle. Razor listened with growing amazement, and that evening ventured into his garden after dark for the first time in decades. He stood speechless among flowers he had never noticed, breathing fragrances he had never experienced. His garden was twice as large as he had imagined. He had been living with only half its gifts. "I spent 20 years seeing only the day shift," he whispered to the moon. "How many other wonders was I missing by turning away from the darkness?" From that night forward, Razor became a gardener of both light and shadow, discovering that rest and darkness held their own irreplaceable gifts. As the stone lantern's gentle glow fades behind us, our path leads to a covered pavilion where the sound of approaching rain drums softly on the roof, carrying with it an ancient lesson about finding blessing in what seems unwelcome. In the terraced rice fields of Vietnam, where emerald paddies climbed mountainsides like liquid stairs reflecting the sky, there lived a farmer named Lin, who had inherited both her family's land and their deep knowledge of working with water. For generations, her ancestors had shaped these hills into intricate systems that captured monsoon rains and channeled them into life-giving irrigation. It was backbreaking work that required constant attention, but it produced some of the most beautiful and productive rice terraces in the entire region. Lin took great pride in maintaining this legacy. She rose before dawn to check water levels, spent her days repairing stone walls and clearing channels, and fell asleep each night to the gentle sound of water flowing through her carefully constructed waterways. Her rice grew tall and golden, her harvests were abundant, and neighbors often sought her advice on water management. But Lin had one persistent enemy that threatened to undo all her careful work: the unpredictable afternoon storms that swept across the valley with devastating force. These weren't the gentle, steady rains that her irrigation system was designed to handle, but violent downpours that arrived without warning, turning her orderly channels into raging torrents and her peaceful paddies into muddy chaos. When storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Lin would work frantically to protect her crops. She built temporary barriers to redirect excess water, covered vulnerable seedlings with bamboo mats, and spent hours after each storm repairing the damage to her terraces. The harder she fought against these wild rains, the more destructive they seemed to become. "Why can't the weather cooperate?" she would mutter, watching dark clouds build over the mountains. "I've created such a perfect system, and these storms come to destroy everything I've built." One particular summer, the storms seemed worse than ever. Week after week, violent downpours would sweep through the valley, undoing Lin's careful preparations and leaving her exhausted from constant repair work. She began to dread the sight of approaching clouds, her anxiety growing with each rumble of distant thunder. After one especially destructive storm had flooded her lowest terrace and washed away weeks of work, Lin sat in her rain shelter feeling defeated. As she watched water still cascading down the mountainside in angry torrents, an elderly woman appeared on the path, seemingly unbothered by the continuing drizzle. This was Grandmother Hoa, a legendary figure in the valley who was said to understand the secret language of water and weather. She was known for having the most resilient crops and the most stable terraces, though no one could explain exactly how she managed this feat. "Child," Grandmother Hoa said, settling beside Lin under the shelter, "you look like someone who has been fighting with the sky." Lin gestured helplessly at her damaged terraces. "Every time I get my system perfect, these storms come and destroy everything. I don't understand why the weather has to be so violent and unpredictable." Grandmother Hoa studied the flowing water with calm eyes. "Tell me, what do you see when you look at this storm water?" "Destruction," Lin replied bitterly. "Chaos, weeks of repair work ahead of me." "Ah," the old woman nodded. "And what do you see when you look at your gentle irrigation water?" "Life, growth, order, everything my crops need to thrive." Grandmother Hoa picked up a handful of the muddy storm water and let it flow between her fingers. "This water that you call destructive, where does it come from?" Lin considered the question. "From the mountains, from the same sources as my irrigation water." "And this mud that you see as damage, what is it really?" "It's soil, rich soil from higher up the mountain." As she spoke, understanding began to dawn. "Exactly," Grandmother Hoa smiled. "These storms that you fight so hard against are not your enemies. They are part of the same system that feeds your crops. The violent rain brings rich sediment from the peaks, depositing the most fertile soil directly onto your terraces. The flooding carries nutrients from the forest down to your fields. The very chaos you resist is nature's way of renewing and enriching your land." She continued, "The mistake is thinking that only gentle, predictable water is good for growth. But crops need both the steady nourishment of regular irrigation and the intense feeding that comes from storms. Fighting against the storms is like trying to have a garden with only sunshine and no rain. You'll get growth, but it will be weak and shallow." Over the following months, Grandmother Hoa taught Lin to work with the storms instead of against them. They modified her terraces to better capture and channel stormwater, created settling ponds where muddy flood water could deposit its rich sediment, and designed overflow systems that turned destructive torrents into controlled distribution networks. Most importantly, she learned to change her relationship with the storms themselves. Instead of seeing them as attacks on her carefully ordered system, she began to recognize them as essential partners in the cycle of growth and renewal. "The storms teach what gentle rains cannot," Grandmother Hoa explained. "They bring deep nourishment from places your irrigation channels could never reach. They clear away accumulated debris and stagnation. They test the strength of your terraces and show you where improvements are needed. Most importantly, they remind you that life's greatest gifts often come wrapped in packages we don't immediately recognize as blessings." By the end of that season, Lin's rice terraces had been transformed. The combination of her careful irrigation and the storm-delivered nutrients produced the most abundant harvest she had ever seen. More surprisingly, her crops proved more resilient to drought and disease, strengthened by the intense nourishment the storms had provided. As we walk deeper into the moonlit garden, we come upon a patch of freshly turned earth where patience teaches its quiet wisdom. In a village nestled between rolling hills, there lived a young farmer named Kenji, who had inherited his grandfather's land, but not his grandfather's patience. While the old man had been known for his steady ways and bountiful harvests, Kenji burned with anxiety about every aspect of farming, especially the mysterious time between planting and sprouting. On the first day of spring, Kenji planted his rice seeds with meticulous care, following his grandfather's detailed notes exactly. But by the third day, worry consumed him. Were the seeds still viable? Had he planted them at the correct depth? Was the soil too wet, too dry, too cold? Unable to contain his anxiety, Kenji dug up a corner of his field to check the seeds' progress. He found them unchanged. No shoots, no roots, just seeds sitting in dark earth. Panic seized him. Something must be wrong. The next day, he dug up another section. Still nothing visible. By the end of the week, Kenji had disturbed nearly a quarter of his field, examining seeds that showed no obvious signs of growth. Each inspection increased his worry. Perhaps he had failed as a farmer before even beginning. His elderly neighbor, Mrs. Tanaka, watched his frantic digging with concern. Finally, she approached him with a cup of tea. "Kenji-san," she said gently, "what are you looking for in that soil?" "My seeds aren't growing," he replied, wiping sweat from his forehead. "I planted them exactly as grandfather's notes instructed, but nothing's happening. They just sit there, unchanged." Mrs. Tanaka smiled knowingly. "And how many times have you disturbed them to check their progress?" Kenji's face flushed with embarrassment. "Perhaps too many." "Come," she said, leading him to her own fields. "Let me show you something your grandfather once taught me." She knelt beside an undisturbed section of earth and gently brushed away the surface soil. There, invisible from above, tiny white roots were threading through the darkness, and the first pale shoots were preparing to push toward light. "Growth happens in the darkness first," she explained. "The roots must establish before the shoots appear. Every time you dig up a seed to check its progress, you interrupt the very process you're hoping to encourage." She covered the emerging plant carefully. "Trust the invisible work, Kenji-san. Your grandfather's greatest skill wasn't his technique, it was his patience." The sound of rain fades as our path leads us to a secluded orchard, where a master gardener tends to trees that seem to defy nature itself, bearing multiple fruits from single trunks, teaching us about the harmony possible when opposites unite. In the ancient kingdom of Persia, where gardens were considered earthly glimpses of paradise, and master gardeners were revered like poets and philosophers, there lived a horticultural artist named Reza, whose specialty was creating the impossible. While other gardeners grew single varieties of fruit on each tree, Reza had mastered the delicate art of grafting, joining branches from different trees into unified wholes that produced miraculous combinations. His masterpiece was a single tree that bore 7 different fruits: sweet apples and tart cherries, succulent pears and bitter quinces, delicate apricots and robust plums, crowned by a single branch of pomegranates like ruby jewels. Visitors would travel from distant lands just to witness this botanical marvel, unable to believe that such diversity could flourish from one trunk. But Reza's greatest challenge came when the young prince of a neighboring kingdom brought him what seemed an impossible request. The prince's kingdom had been torn apart by civil war between two factions, one that valued sweetness, beauty, and gentle pleasures, the other that prized strength, endurance, and bitter truths. The division had become so complete that the two sides could barely speak to each other, let alone work together to rebuild their land. "Master Reza," the prince said, "I need you to create something that has never existed, a tree that bears both the sweetest fruit and the most bitter, side by side on the same branches. If I can show my people that such opposites can not only coexist but actually strengthen each other, perhaps there is hope for healing our divided kingdom." Reza studied the young prince carefully. Most requests for grafting came from desire for abundance or novelty, but this carried the weight of genuine need. "What you ask is extremely difficult," he said finally. "Sweet and bitter varieties often reject each other during grafting. Their different growing patterns, their conflicting needs. Nature seems to resist such combinations." "I understand the challenge," the prince replied. "But surely if anyone can achieve this miracle, it would be the master who created the seven-fruit tree." Reza accepted the challenge, but his first attempts ended in failure. Every time he tried to graft intensely sweet fruit branches with extremely bitter ones, the unions would fail. The sweet branches would wither when joined to bitter stock, or the bitter grafts would be rejected by sweet root systems. The combinations seemed to create internal conflict that weakened the entire tree. After months of failed experiments, Reza sat discouraged in his workshop, surrounded by failed grafts and dying branch cuttings. As he contemplated giving up, his elderly mentor, Master Hassan, arrived for one of his rare visits. "Tell me about your failures," Master Hassan said, examining the rejected grafts with interest. Reza explained his attempts to combine the most extremely sweet and bitter varieties, his theory that dramatic contrast would create the most powerful symbol for the prince's kingdom. Master Hassan listened thoughtfully, then asked, "When you created your seven-fruit tree, did you begin with the most different varieties?" "No," Reza admitted. "I started with closely related fruits and gradually added more diversity as the tree established stability." "And yet now you try to force the greatest extremes together immediately," Master Hassan observed. "Tell me, in human relationships, do sworn enemies become best friends overnight? Or must there be intermediate steps, gradual understanding, careful bridge building?" The lesson began to dawn on Reza. He had been approaching the grafting like a conquest rather than a courtship. The next day, he began a completely different approach. Instead of trying to force the sweetest and most bitter varieties together directly, Reza created a gradual progression. He started with a mildly sweet apple variety and grafted it to a slightly tart cherry. When this union proved successful, he added a branch that was a bit more bitter. Step by step, over an entire growing season, he gradually introduced greater contrasts, allowing each addition to establish itself before adding the next level of difference. The key breakthrough came when Reza realized that the intermediate branches weren't just stepping stones, they were essential translators. A moderately sweet tart variety could accept and integrate both sweeter and more bitter companions, serving as a bridge between extremes that could never join directly. After 2 full years of patient work, Reisa's tree achieved what had seemed impossible. From a single trunk grew branches bearing the sweetest honey apples alongside the most astringent quinces, their flavors distinct yet harmonious, their different growing needs somehow balanced by the tree's unified root system. When the prince saw the completed tree, he wept. "You've shown me something I needed to understand about healing my kingdom. The sweet and bitter factions cannot join directly. The divide is too great. But there are people in between. Those who understand both perspectives, who can serve as bridges." The prince returned to his homeland and began implementing Reisa's lesson. Instead of trying to force the extreme factions together in direct negotiation, he identified and nurtured the moderate voices who could speak both languages. These bridge builders gradually created connections between the divided groups, translating each side's concerns to the other until understanding became possible. Within 5 years, the kingdom had healed its divisions. The former enemies discovered that their different strengths, the sweet faction's gifts for beauty and culture, the bitter faction's talents for endurance and truth-telling, actually complemented each other when properly integrated. Reisa's grafted tree lived for many decades, its impossible combination of sweet and bitter fruits continuing to remind visitors that apparent opposites often contained hidden possibilities for unity, and that the most profound harmony sometimes required patient, skillful mediation between extremes. From the butterfly meadow, our path leads us through gathering dusk to a secluded corner of the garden where an ancient stone lantern stands sentinel, its weathered face holding secrets about the nature of illumination itself. In the shadow of Mount Fuji, where cherry blossoms fell like snow each spring and temples clung to mountainsides like prayers made manifest, there stood a garden famous throughout Japan for its nighttime beauty. At its heart sat an ornate stone lantern, carved centuries ago by master craftsmen, whose names had been lost to time. This lantern was no ordinary garden ornament, but a work of art that had taken 3 years to complete. Its surface covered with intricate dragons, flowering vines, and Buddhist symbols that seemed to dance in flickering candlelight. The lantern's current caretaker was a young monk named Kenji, who had been assigned the honor of maintaining this sacred garden after years of devoted service at the temple. Each evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Kenji would light the candle within the lantern and marvel at its elaborate beauty. The carved figures seemed to come alive in the dancing shadows, and visitors often gasped at the magical transformation that occurred as darkness fell. But as months passed, Kenji became increasingly preoccupied with the lantern itself. He spent hours polishing its stone surfaces until they gleamed, carefully cleaning each intricate carving and showing visitors the remarkable craftsmanship that made it so special. He commissioned detailed histories of its creation and could recite the names of every master who had worked on its construction. "Look at these exquisite details," he would tell pilgrims who came to meditate in the evening garden. "See how the dragon's scales catch the light, how the lotus petals seem to unfurl in the flame's glow. This lantern is surely one of the most beautiful objects in all of Japan." The more Kenji focused on the lantern's physical beauty, the more possessive he became of it. He worried constantly about potential damage from weather or careless visitors. He created elaborate protective measures, building barriers to keep people at what he considered a respectful distance. Most concerningly, he began to see the lantern itself as the source of the garden's magic, rather than merely a vessel for it. One autumn evening, as Kenji was giving his usual detailed tour of the lantern's artistic features to a group of visitors, an elderly woman at the back of the group raised her hand quietly. "Young master," she said in a voice soft as silk, "this lantern is indeed beautiful, but tell me, what is its purpose?" Kenji straightened proudly. "Its purpose is to be magnificent, honored grandmother. It exists to showcase the incredible skill of ancient craftsmen and to add beauty to our garden." The old woman nodded thoughtfully. "And when you light the candle inside, what happens?" "Well," Kenji replied, slightly puzzled by the simple question, "the light illuminates the carvings and makes them even more beautiful to behold." "Ah," said the woman, "and where does that light go after it passes through the lantern?" Kenji looked around, suddenly noticing what he had somehow stopped seeing. The light from within the lantern flowed outward, illuminating the entire garden. It lit the stone pathways so visitors could walk safely in the darkness. It revealed the quiet beauty of night-blooming flowers. It created pools of gentle radiance where people could sit and contemplate the mysteries of existence. The lantern's true gift wasn't its own beauty, but the light it allowed to pass through and spread throughout the space. "The light illuminates everything else," Kenji said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. The old woman smiled. "Exactly. Now tell me, what would happen if this beautiful lantern were completely solid, with no openings for light to pass through?" Kenji imagined the scenario with growing realization. It would be useless. No matter how beautiful the carvings, no matter how skilled the craftsmanship, if no light could pass through it, it would serve no purpose in the garden. "And so," the woman continued gently, "what makes this lantern truly valuable? Its substance, or its emptiness?" The question hit Kenji like a temple bell reverberating through his entire understanding. He had been so focused on the lantern's solid beauty, its carved dragons and lotus flowers, that he had forgotten its essential nature. The lantern's power came not from what it was made of, but from what it was not made of. The empty spaces, the carefully designed openings, the hollowness within, these were what allowed it to fulfill its true purpose. "The emptiness," he whispered. "The lantern's gift is its emptiness, its transparency to the light." The old woman nodded approvingly. "A lantern that hoards light serves no one. A lantern that allows light to pass through freely serves everyone. The most beautiful lantern is useless if it cannot let light flow." Over the following weeks, this teaching transformed Kenji's understanding not just of the garden, but of his own spiritual practice. He began to see that he had been trying to make himself like a solid lantern, accumulating knowledge, experiences, and spiritual achievements as if they were carved decorations that made him more impressive. But the old woman's wisdom showed him that his real spiritual work was to become empty enough, transparent enough, for wisdom and compassion to flow through him freely. He started spending less time polishing the lantern and more time appreciating how its light served others. He removed the protective barriers that had kept people at a distance, understanding that a lantern's purpose was to be accessible, not protected. Most importantly, he began to see his own role as similar to the lantern, not to be admired for his spiritual attainments, but to be transparent enough for the Dharma to flow through him to others. The stone lantern became his daily teacher. Each evening as he lit its flame, he would remember that true spiritual beauty lay not in accumulating impressive qualities, but in developing the emptiness that allows divine light to pass through unobstructed. The moonlit path leads us to a grove where two ancient trees stand side by side, their contrasting wisdom etched in bark and branch. In a temple garden where monks came to contemplate the nature of strength, there grew two magnificent trees. The first was a mighty oak, its trunk thick as a temple pillar, its branches reaching skyward with unwavering determination. The second was a graceful weeping willow, its slender branches flowing earthward like water frozen in time. The oak took great pride in its rigid strength. "Look at me," it would whisper to the wind. "I stand unmoved by any storm. My branches never bend, my trunk never sways. This is true power, to remain unchanged no matter what forces arise." The willow, with its branches that danced in every breeze, seemed humble by comparison. "Perhaps," it would murmur softly, "but I find peace in yielding to what cannot be resisted." The oak scoffed. "Yielding is weakness. Watch how I maintain my dignity while you bow and sway like a servant to every passing wind." The monks admire strength, not submission. For years, the two trees coexisted in their philosophical difference, the oak rigid and proud, the willow flowing and flexible. The monks indeed did admire the oak's impressive stature and uncompromising stance. Then came the great storm of the autumn equinox. Winds howled through the valley with unprecedented fury, rain lashed the earth, and lightning split the darkness. The tempest raged for 3 days and 3 nights, testing every living thing. The willow bent so low its branches touched the ground, its trunk curving like a dancer in the hurricane's embrace. It yielded completely to the storm's power, offering no resistance, becoming one with the wind's wild energy. The oak, true to its nature, stood firm against the tempest. Its mighty trunk resisted every gust, its proud branches refusing to bend. "I will not yield," it declared to the storm. "I will not break." On the third night, with a sound like thunder, the oak's rigid resistance finally met its match. The great tree split and fell, its uncompromising strength becoming its downfall. When dawn broke and the storm passed, the willow slowly straightened, unharmed. Its flexible wisdom had preserved it, while the oak's rigid strength had brought destruction. The surviving monks found profound teaching in this display. The abbot gathered them beneath the willow's restored branches. "True strength," he said, "knows when to stand firm and when to bend." As we drift away from the floating gardens, our path leads us to a hillside meadow, where thousands of wildflowers sway in the evening breeze, and the ancient dance between bee and blossom reveals the secret of mutual nourishment. In the highlands of Scotland, where purple heather carpeted the hills and ancient stone circles stood as silent witnesses to countless seasons, there lived a beekeeper named Moira, who tended to dozens of hives scattered across the moorlands. Her bees were famous throughout the region for producing the most exquisite heather honey, dark and aromatic, with a flavor that seemed to capture the very essence of the wild landscape. But among all her hives, there was one that troubled Moira deeply. This particular colony had established itself in a remote corner of her property, near a patch of rare orchids that bloomed only once every few years. The orchids were Moira's pride and joy, delicate, ethereal flowers of pale pink and white that were protected by law and visited by botanists from distant universities. Moira's concern arose from what she perceived as a conflict between her two passions. The bees, she noticed, were visiting the precious orchids daily, and she worried that their constant attention might damage these fragile, irreplaceable flowers. At the same time, she feared that the orchid's complex blooms might somehow contaminate or confuse her bees' honey production. "Those bees are going to ruin my orchids," she muttered one morning, watching worker bees crawling deep into the intricate flowers. And heaven knows what strange effects these exotic blooms might have on the honey. I should relocate that hive before serious damage occurs. But before making any drastic moves, Moira decided to consult with Dr. MacLeod, a retired botanist from Edinburgh who had been studying the moorland's ecosystem for over 30 years. She found him, as usual, crouched among the heather with his magnifying glass, completely absorbed in observing some tiny detail of plant life. "Dr. MacLeod," Moira called, "I need your advice about a problem with my bees and your precious orchids." The elderly scientist looked up with bright, curious eyes. "Ah, the bees and orchids. What kind of problem are you seeing?" Moira explained her concerns about the potential damage the bees might cause to the rare flowers, and her worries about how the exotic nectar might affect her honey production. Dr. MacLeod listened intently, then asked, "How long have you been observing this interaction?" "About 3 weeks now, ever since the orchids began blooming." "And in those 3 weeks, have you noticed any actual damage to the flowers?" Moira considered this carefully. "Well, no, not exactly. But surely all that crawling around inside the blooms must be harmful." "Let me show you something," Dr. MacLeod said, leading her to the orchid patch. He pointed to a flower that had clearly been visited by bees. There were tiny grains of pollen visible on its petals. "Look closely at this blossom. What do you see?" Moira examined the flower, expecting to find signs of damage. Instead, she noticed that the orchid seemed particularly vibrant, its colors more intense than the unvisited blooms nearby. "It looks healthier, actually." "Exactly," Dr. MacLeod smiled. "These orchids have evolved over millions of years to attract specific pollinators. Every aspect of their shape, scent, and color is designed to entice bees and other insects. Far from being damaged by the visits, they depend on them completely." He guided her to observe more closely. "Watch what happens when a bee enters the flower. See how the orchid's structure guides the bee to brush against the pollen sacs. The bee collects nectar for food, but in doing so, it also collects pollen, which it then carries to other orchids. Without this exchange, these flowers could never reproduce." Over the following days, Dr. MacLeod taught Moira to see the relationship between her bees and the orchids as a perfect example of mutualistic symbiosis. The orchids provided high-quality nectar that produced some of the most extraordinary honey she had ever tasted. Complex, floral, with subtle notes that no other flowers could provide. In return, her bees ensured the orchid's genetic diversity and continuation by carrying pollen between distant plants. But what I thought was a conflict, Moira marveled, watching the intricate dance of pollination, is actually a collaboration that benefits both. More than that, Dr. MacLeod explained, it's a relationship so deeply interdependent that neither species could thrive here without the other. The orchids have evolved to bloom exactly when your bees need the highest quality nutrition for their winter preparations. The bees' visiting schedule perfectly matches the orchid's reproductive cycle. They've been partners in this dance for millennia. As the orchid season progressed, Moira began to understand the profound implications of this relationship. She had been thinking in terms of competition and conflict, assuming that what benefited one must somehow harm the other. But nature revealed a different model entirely, mutual flourishing through reciprocal generosity. The bees didn't take from the orchids. They traded their pollination services for nectar. The orchids didn't sacrifice their resources. They invested them in a relationship that ensured their genetic future. Both species gave what they had in abundance and received what they needed for survival. This lesson transformed Moira's approach to beekeeping. She began to see her entire operation as a web of mutual relationships. Her bees provided pollination services to local farmers, who in turn allowed her hives on their land. She traded honey with neighbors for garden vegetables, creating a network of exchange that benefited everyone involved. Most profoundly, she realized that her own role as beekeeper was part of this same pattern. She provided shelter, protection, and care for her bees, while they offered honey, pollination services, and the deep satisfaction that came from participating in nature's ancient partnerships. The rare orchids bloomed more prolifically than anyone could remember, while Moira's honey from that special hive became legendary throughout Scotland, sought after by connoisseurs who recognized its unique, ethereal flavor, the taste of perfect collaboration between bee and flower. As we continue deeper into the garden's wisdom, the moonlit path leads us to a grove where thousands of bamboo stalks sway in perfect harmony, their gentle rustling like whispered secrets from the earth itself. In the mountains of southern China, where mist clung to ancient peaks and valleys echoed with the songs of unseen birds, there lived a gardener named Wei, who prided himself on creating the strongest, most substantial plants possible. His vegetables grew thick and heavy. His trees bore massive trunks. His flowers bloomed with dense layered petals that impressed every visitor with their solid presence. Wei believed that strength came from substance, that power lay in weight and mass. He fed his plants rich fertilizers, bound their stems with supports, and cultivated density in every growing thing. His garden was famous throughout the province for producing the most robust specimens anyone had ever seen. One spring, Wei acquired a section of land that contained an ancient bamboo grove. The previous owner, an elderly Taoist hermit, had tended these bamboos for decades, and they had grown into towering specimens that swayed gracefully in even the lightest breeze. Wei examined them with a critical eye, noting their hollow stems and delicate appearance. "This will never do," he muttered. running his hands along the smooth, empty stalks. How can plants so thin and hollow be of any use? They look ready to break at the first strong wind. Wei set about improving the bamboo grove with his usual methods. He poured rich fertilizer around their roots, expecting to thicken their stalks. He installed elaborate support systems to prevent their swaying. Most ambitiously, he began an experiment to fill the hollow interiors with a special mixture of nutrients and binding agents, believing this would create the strongest bamboo in all of China. The bamboo responded poorly to his interventions. The over-fertilized plants grew sickly and yellowed. The supports prevented their natural movement, causing stress fractures in their stems. Most distressingly, the bamboo he attempted to fill began dying from the inside out, their natural circulation systems blocked by his well-intentioned additions. As summer progressed, Wei watched his improved bamboo grove struggling, while a section of untouched bamboo continued thriving. The unaltered plants grew taller and more graceful, their hollow stems carrying them to heights his heavy, substantial plants could never reach. One evening, as Wei sat among his failing experiments, an old monk appeared on the path. This was Master Chen, a wandering teacher known for his understanding of natural principles. He observed Wei's struggling bamboo with knowing eyes. "Tell me, friend," Master Chen said gently, "what makes bamboo strong?" Wei gestured to his dying, filled stalks. "Substance, weight, density. I've been trying to give these hollow plants some real strength, but they seem to reject improvement." Master Chen smiled and walked to the thriving, untouched section of the grove. He placed his palm against one of the tall, swaying stalks. "Watch," he said, as a strong evening breeze swept through the valley. Wei's heavy, supported bamboo fought against the wind, their filled stems rigid and unyielding. Several cracked under the pressure, their artificial substance becoming a liability. But the hollow bamboo danced with the wind, bending so far their tops nearly touched the ground, yet springing back unharmed when each gust passed. "Do you see?" Master Chen asked. "Their strength comes not from what they contain, but from what they don't contain. The emptiness inside allows them to flex without breaking. Their hollowness is not weakness, it's the source of their resilience." He continued, running his hand along a smooth, hollow stem. "These bamboo can bend 90 degrees and not break, because there's space inside for the pressure to move through them. They don't fight the wind, they dance with it. They don't resist force, they become fluid with it." Master Chen tapped the stem gently, and Wei heard a clear, musical tone ring out. The emptiness also gives them voice. A filled bamboo cannot sing. Only the hollow ones can carry the wind's music. "But surely," Wei protested, "emptiness means weakness. How can nothing be stronger than something?" "Watch a reed in the river," Master Chen replied. "It bends with every current, yet survives floods that uproot mighty trees. Watch water itself. It has no shape, no substance, yet it carves canyons through solid rock. The Tao Te Ching teaches us, nothing in the world is softer than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard and strong." He gestured to the grove of healthy bamboo swaying in harmony. These plants understand what many humans forget, that emptiness is not absence, but space. Space for movement, space for breath, space for life to flow freely. When we try to fill every space, we create rigidity. When we allow emptiness, we create possibility. Over the following months, Wei learned to work with bamboo's natural hollowness rather than against it. He removed his artificial supports, stopped his filling experiments, and began to appreciate the elegant strength of emptiness. His bamboo grove not only recovered, but flourished, growing taller and more graceful than ever before. The grove became a meditation spot for travelers who found peace in watching the tall stems sway and listening to their wind songs. Wei discovered that the hollow bamboo was incredibly useful, stronger than his filled versions for construction, perfect for carrying water, and beautiful in its natural state. Most importantly, Wei began to understand that the same principle applied to his own inner landscape. He had spent years trying to fill himself with knowledge, achievements, and experiences, believing that accumulation meant strength. But the bamboo taught him that sometimes the most powerful thing was to create space. Space for wisdom to enter, space for peace to settle, space for life to flow freely through his being. As the Buddha taught, emptiness is not nothingness, but the space in which all things arise and pass away. The bamboo grove had become Wei's teacher in this profound truth. Our path curves around the willow's graceful form, toward a humble corner of the garden where decay and renewal dance their eternal cycle. In a monastery high in the Tibetan mountains, there lived a young monk named Tenzin who had dedicated himself to creating the most beautiful garden possible. He spent his days cultivating perfect flowers, arranging stones with artistic precision, and maintaining paths of spotless cleanliness. His garden was admired by all who visited for its pristine beauty. But there was one corner of the monastery grounds that filled Tenzin with disgust. The compost area where kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, and garden waste accumulated in dark, rotting piles. The smell offended him. The sight of decomposition disturbed his aesthetic sensibilities, and he avoided that corner entirely, asking other monks to tend it. "How can such ugliness exist beside our beautiful garden?" he complained to the head gardener, an ancient monk named Lobsang, whose hands were permanently stained with soil. "Surely we could find somewhere else for this unpleasantness." Lobsang listened patiently, then invited Tenzin to join him on his morning rounds. They walked through Tenzin's immaculate flower beds, past his perfectly raked gravel paths, until they reached the dreaded compost corner. "Tell me," Lobsang said, kneeling beside the dark pile, "what do you see here?" "Rot, decay, waste, death," Tenzin replied, wrinkling his nose. Lobsang dug his hands deep into the compost, bringing up rich, dark earth that smelled of forests and rain. "And what do you see here?" "Dirt," Tenzin answered, puzzled. "This dirt," Lobsang said with a gentle smile, "is what feeds every beautiful flower in your garden. Last year's fallen petals, this spring's kitchen scraps, autumn's dead leaves, all transformed into the richest nourishment. Without this decay, your roses would not bloom." He led Tenzin to the base of the garden's most magnificent rosebush and showed him how its roots reached toward the composted soil they had spread there months before. "What you call waste, the earth calls treasure. What you see as death, nature sees as the beginning of new life. But the smell, The appearance, Tenzin protested. Yes, Lobsang nodded. Transformation is not always beautiful to observe. But would you rather have roses or maintain your comfort with appearances? That day, Tenzin began to understand the sacred alchemy of decomposition, how yesterday's endings become tomorrow's beginnings, how apparent loss transforms into abundant life. Our path winds away from the pruned orchard toward a sun-dappled meadow where butterflies dance among wildflowers, and the boundaries between dreaming and waking blur like morning mist. In the province of Shandong, where rolling hills stretch toward the horizon like green waves on an endless sea, there lived a gardener named Zhuang, who had devoted his life to creating the most extraordinary butterfly garden in all of China. His passion began in childhood when he discovered that certain flowers could attract clouds of magnificent butterflies, monarchs with wings like stained glass, swallowtails that danced on air currents, and tiny blues that shimmered like scattered sapphires. Zhuang's garden became famous throughout the region. Visitors would travel for days to walk among his carefully planned butterfly havens, where every plant was chosen for its ability to nourish and attract these delicate creatures. He knew which flowers provided the sweetest nectar, which leaves served as nurseries for caterpillars, and which arrangements created the most favorable microclimates for butterfly communities to thrive. But despite his expertise and the beauty of his garden, Zhuang felt increasingly troubled by questions he couldn't answer. As he watched the butterflies' effortless flight, their apparent joy in simply existing, he wondered about the nature of identity and consciousness. What was it like to be a butterfly? Did they experience the world as he did, or was their reality completely different? These philosophical musings grew stronger each year until they began to consume his thoughts. He would spend hours lying among his flowers, watching butterflies, and wondering whether his careful human planning and their spontaneous natural behavior were really so different. Sometimes, lost in observation, he felt as if he almost understood their perspective, as if the boundary between gardener and garden was dissolving. One particularly warm summer afternoon, Zhuang fell asleep in the heart of his garden, surrounded by clouds of butterflies and the gentle humming of bees. As sleep took him, his dreams became unusually vivid and strange. In his dream, Zhuang found himself transformed into a magnificent butterfly with wings that caught and reflected sunlight like jewels. He flew effortlessly through the garden he knew so well, but everything appeared completely different from this new perspective. The flowers he had planted with such careful consideration now seemed like vast, colorful worlds, each one offering unique fragrances and textures he had never noticed from his human height. As the dream butterfly, Zhuang experienced pure freedom. He had no concerns about garden maintenance, no worries about attracting visitors, no complex thoughts about identity or purpose. There was only the joy of flight, the sweetness of nectar, the warmth of sunlight on his wings, and the simple pleasure of dancing through the air with others of his kind. Time seemed different in butterfly consciousness. Moments stretched into eternities of pure sensation, while entire seasons compressed into single heartbeats. There was no past to regret or future to plan for, only the eternal present of wing beats, flower visits, and the endless dance of existence. In the dream, Zhuang Butterfly felt completely natural and at home. This wasn't a strange transformation, but a return to his true nature. The complex human concerns that usually filled his mind seemed like distant memories from another lifetime. He was purely, simply, joyfully himself, a being of light and motion, perfectly adapted to his world. The dream felt like it lasted for months or perhaps years. Zhuang Butterfly experienced the full cycle of seasons from this new perspective, weathering storms in ways humans could never manage, finding sustenance in sources humans overlooked, and moving through the world with a grace and efficiency that human walking could never match. But eventually, the dream began to fade. Zhuang Butterfly felt himself growing heavier, his wings becoming less responsive, his butterfly companions seeming to drift away like memories. Gradually, he became aware of lying on solid ground, of having a human body, of breathing air into human lungs. Zhuang opened his eyes to find himself back in his familiar garden, surrounded by the flowers he had planted and the butterflies he had attracted. But something fundamental had changed. As he sat up slowly, brushing flower petals from his clothes, a profound confusion settled over him. "I am Zhuang who dreamed of being a butterfly," he said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the garden's quiet. "But how do I know I am not a butterfly dreaming of being Zhuang?" The question wasn't philosophical speculation, but lived reality. The butterfly experience had felt completely real and natural, while his human identity now seemed somewhat artificial and constructed. Which was the dream and which was waking? Which was his true nature and which was the temporary illusion? He looked at the butterflies dancing around him with new eyes. Were they also dreaming of being human sometimes? Did they question their identity as he questioned his? Or had they found some peace with the fluid nature of consciousness that still eluded him? Over the following days, Zhuang found that his certainty about the solid nature of his identity had been permanently shaken. Sometimes he felt fully human, concerned with garden maintenance, weather patterns, and visitor satisfaction. But at other moments, especially when he was very still among his flowers, he felt butterfly consciousness arising again, the lightness, the pure presence, the effortless being. Rather than troubling him, this fluidity began to bring unexpected peace. Zhuang realized that perhaps the question of which identity was real was less important than the recognition that consciousness itself was far more mysterious and flexible than he had ever imagined. His garden work became a form of meditation on the nature of being. Whether he was Zhuang tending flowers for butterflies or a butterfly dreaming of being a gardener seemed less significant than the fact that somehow, through whatever mystery of consciousness, the tending was happening, the flowers were blooming, and the dance between gardener and garden continued in its eternal, beautiful ambiguity. Following the winding path, we arrive at a still pond where moonlight reveals truths that only emerge in perfect stillness. In a mountain retreat where seekers came to discover their true nature, there lived a restless monk named Hui, who had been searching for enlightenment for 7 long years. Despite countless hours of meditation, study, and contemplation, the clarity he sought remained elusive as morning mist. At the center of the retreat grounds lay a perfectly circular pond, its surface so still it reflected the sky like polished obsidian. Master Chen often sent students there for contemplation, but Hui found the pond frustrating. Its silence offered no answers. Its emptiness provided no insights. One afternoon, driven by desperation, Hui knelt at the pond's edge and peered into its depths. "Show me my true face," he demanded, stirring the water with his hands. "Reveal the Buddha nature I cannot find." The pond's surface erupted into ripples and waves. Hui could see nothing but distorted fragments, pieces of sky, broken reflections of clouds, his own face shattered into countless shifting pieces. The harder he searched, the more he stirred the water, the less he could see. "Where is my true self?" he cried, agitating the water even more violently. "I've practiced for years. Why won't you show me what I'm looking for?" Master Chen, walking by, observed Hui's frantic searching. He sat quietly beside the pond without speaking, his presence calm as the mountains themselves. Gradually, Hui's stirring slowed, then stopped entirely. "Master," Hui pleaded, "I cannot see my reflection clearly. The water won't hold still long enough for me to understand what I'm looking at." "And who is disturbing the water?" Master Chen asked gently. Hui looked at his hands, still dripping from his desperate searching. Slowly, understanding began to dawn. He withdrew his hands and sat in complete stillness beside his teacher. Gradually, infinitely slowly, the pond's surface began to calm. The ripples grew smaller, the waves settled, the distortion cleared. As perfect stillness returned, Hui saw not just his own face reflected with crystal clarity, but the entire sky, the surrounding trees, the clouds drifting overhead, and depths that seemed to extend infinitely downward. "Now," Master Chen whispered, "what do you see?" "Everything," Hui breathed in wonder. "When I stop stirring the water, I can see everything, including what was always there, waiting beneath the surface. The bamboo grove's gentle whispers guide us along a winding path to where 4 different gardens meet, each one painted in the colors of a different season, teaching us about the natural rhythms of the heart. In the mountains of Korea, where ancient temples nestled among peaks that touched the clouds, there lived a garden keeper named Sujin, who had been entrusted with maintaining the monastery's most sacred space, the Garden of 4 Seasons. This was no ordinary garden, but a carefully designed landscape where spring, summer, autumn, and winter were each represented in separate quadrants, allowing monks to meditate on the eternal cycle of change. But Sujin had a secret struggle that no one knew about. While she tended the seasonal gardens with skill and devotion, she waged a constant war against the seasons within her own heart. When sadness came like winter, she fought it with forced cheerfulness. When anger blazed like summer heat, she tried to cool it through rigid meditation. When the restless energy of spring arose in her spirit, she attempted to contain it with extra work. When the letting go of autumn touched her soul, she resisted its melancholy with desperate activity. She believed that a spiritual person should maintain constant equilibrium, like an eternal spring where only pleasant emotions bloomed. The natural cycles of feeling seemed like failures to her, obstacles to overcome, rather than seasons to experience. One particular autumn, as the monastery's maple trees turned brilliant shades of red and gold, Sujin found herself overwhelmed by an inexplicable sadness. Her meditation felt heavy, her heart ached without clear reason. and she moved through her garden duties with leaden steps. The more she tried to shake off this melancholy, the deeper it seemed to settle into her bones. "I should be grateful," she whispered to the falling leaves. "I have meaningful work, a beautiful place to live, teachings to guide me. Why can't I make this sadness go away?" Unknown to Sujin, the monastery's aged master, Venerable Kim, had been observing her struggle with compassionate eyes. He had seen many students over the decades try to force their inner seasons into permanent spring, and he recognized the suffering this resistance created. One morning, as Sujin worked in the autumn garden, mechanically raking fallen leaves while fighting back tears, Master Kim approached with 2 cups of tea. He sat beside her on a wooden bench overlooking the grove of maples, their branches now nearly bare. "Tell me," he said gently, "what do you see when you look at these trees?" Sujin looked up, confused by the simple question. "Trees that have lost their leaves, Master. They look dead, sad." "Ah," Master Kim nodded. "And what will happen to them in spring?" "They'll grow new leaves, bloom again." "And if these trees fought against autumn, if they tried to keep their summer leaves through sheer will, what would happen?" Sujin considered this. They would exhaust themselves. The old leaves would wither but not fall, blocking the light from new growth. They would become sick. "Exactly," Master Kim said, sipping his tea thoughtfully. "Now tell me, what season is your heart experiencing right now?" The question cut through all her pretenses. Sujin's carefully maintained composure cracked, and tears flowed freely. "Winter," she whispered. "Everything feels cold and empty. I've tried so hard to make it spring again, but the sadness just gets heavier." Master Kim placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "My dear child, you tend this garden with such wisdom, understanding exactly what each season needs. You don't try to make the winter garden bloom like spring, or the autumn trees keep their summer leaves. You honor each season's gifts and allow its natural progression. Yet with your own heart, you become a tyrant, demanding only one season be allowed." He gestured to the bare branches around them. "Look deeper at this autumn garden. Is it truly dead? Or is it gathering strength for new growth? The leaves that fall become compost that will nourish next year's blooms. The bare branches allow light to reach sleeping seeds. The apparent emptiness is actually profound preparation." Sujin looked around with new eyes. Even in its starkness, the autumn garden held an austere beauty. The bare tree limbs created elegant patterns against the sky. The fallen leaves formed a rich carpet that would nourish the soil. And in the quiet emptiness, she could hear sounds that the full foliage of summer had masked. The distant stream, the wind's subtle variations, the deep silence that held everything. "Your heart's winter," Master Kim continued, "is not a failure to be fixed, but a season to be honored. Just as outer winter allows the earth to rest and regenerate, inner winter allows your soul to go deep, to compost old experiences, to gather strength for new growth. If you try to force your heart into permanent summer, you'll exhaust yourself and miss the gifts that only the darker seasons can bring." Over the following weeks, Master Kim taught Sujin to recognize and work with her inner seasons rather than against them. When the heart's winter came, she learned to embrace its contemplative depth, its invitation to go inward, its clearing away of what no longer served. When spring energy arose, she welcomed its restless creativity. When summer brought intense emotions, she allowed them their full expression. When autumn brought letting go, she honored its wisdom. Each emotional season, he explained, has its own medicine. Winter brings rest and deep reflection. Spring brings renewal and fresh perspective. Summer brings passion and full engagement with life. Autumn brings harvest wisdom and the grace of release. A heart that experiences all seasons fully is far richer than one stuck in perpetual spring. Sujin discovered that when she stopped fighting her natural rhythms, they began to flow more smoothly. The winters became less harsh because she no longer added the suffering of resistance to their natural melancholy. The springs felt more genuine because they arose from real rest rather than forced cheerfulness. Most importantly, she learned that just as the garden's seasons created its overall beauty through their interplay, her heart's seasons wove together to create the full tapestry of her spiritual life. Each feeling season brought its own gifts, its own teachings, its own essential contribution to her growth. The pond's perfect stillness guides us to a secluded grove where the deepest gardening happens without tools or effort. In the valleys of ancient China, there lived two gardeners whose methods could not have been more different. The first, Master Liu, was famous for his impressive collection of tools: silver pruning shears, bronze watering vessels, jade-handled cultivators, and wooden implements carved by master craftsmen. His tool shed was larger than most homes, organized with military precision. The second gardener, an elderly woman known simply as Grandmother May, owned nothing but a small wooden bucket and her bare hands. Visitors often mistook her for a beggar, sitting quietly in corners of gardens with her empty palms resting in her lap. When the provincial governor announced a contest to create the most beautiful garden, both gardeners accepted the challenge. They were given identical plots of neglected land and one full season to work their magic. Master Liu arrived at dawn with a cart full of tools. He measured, calculated, and began systematic transformation. His pruning shears flashed in the sunlight. His cultivators churned the soil to perfect consistency. His specialized implements attacked every imperfection with mechanical precision. From sunrise to sunset, the sound of his tools filled the air. Grandmother May simply sat on a stone in the center of her plot. For hours, she remained motionless, hands empty, eyes soft, breathing slowly. Passers-by whispered that perhaps age had finally claimed her abilities. But those who watched carefully noticed subtle things. Seeds seemed to find their way into her soil without planting. Birds dropped beneficial things in precisely the right locations. Rain fell more gently on her plot. Young shoots appeared stronger, grew straighter, as if drawn by invisible guidance. "What tools do you use?" curious visitors asked her. "Attention," she replied simply. "Patience. Love." When the season ended, Master Liu's garden was technically perfect. Every line precise, every plant positioned optimally. But Grandmother May's garden possessed something indefinable, a quality that made visitors linger, that brought tears to sensitive eyes, that seemed to grow more beautiful the longer one looked. The governor studied both gardens carefully, "Master Liu," he said, "your garden displays impressive skill. But Grandmother May, yours displays soul." Later, someone asked her secret. She smiled, holding up her empty hands. When your hands are empty, they can receive everything. When your heart is still, it can guide what your hands cannot force. From the meadow where bee and flower dance their eternal partnership, our path winds upward to a hilltop where a massive oak tree stands alone against the star-filled sky, its ancient branches holding memories of countless generations who have found rest beneath its sheltering canopy. In the countryside of England, where rolling green hills stretch toward horizons dotted with stone cottages and church spires, there grew an oak tree of such magnificent age and size that it had become a landmark for the entire region. Local historians estimated it had stood for over 800 years, its trunk so vast that 12 people holding hands could barely encircle it, its crown so broad that an entire village festival could shelter beneath its branches. The tree had been designated a National Heritage Site, protected by law and visited by pilgrims who came to touch something that had witnessed so much history. But despite all the attention and reverence it received, the ancient oak felt profoundly lonely. For you see, this tree possessed something that few humans suspected, a deep, slow consciousness that remembered everything it had experienced across the centuries. The oak remembered when it was just a sapling, planted by a Saxon farmer who dreamed of shade for his grandchildren. It remembered the Norman soldiers who had carved their names into its young bark, the medieval pilgrims who had rested beneath its growing branches, and the Civil War refugees who had hidden in its hollow trunk during the violent years of the 1640s. Century after century, the oak had provided sanctuary for countless beings. Generations of families had picnicked in its shade. Lovers had carved their initials in its bark. Children had climbed its sturdy branches, and the elderly had found peace sitting against its broad trunk. Birds had nested in its crown. Squirrels had raised their young in its hollow places, and countless insects had made their homes among its leaves and bark. But as the modern world grew more hurried and disconnected, fewer people seemed to truly notice the tree. Visitors would take quick photographs, read the historical placard, and move on to their next destination. They saw the oak as a monument, a curiosity from the past, rather than a living being with its own experience and wisdom. The loneliness deepened when the tree began to notice that humans had lost the ability to simply be present. Even when they sat beneath its branches, they were constantly distracted by devices, conversations, or internal chatter. They seemed incapable of the deep stillness that the oak knew as its natural state. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted down like memories made visible, a young woman named Sarah arrived at the oak tree. She was different from the usual visitors. She carried no camera, consulted no guidebook, and seemed in no hurry to be anywhere else. Instead, she simply sat down against the tree's massive trunk and closed her eyes. The oak felt something it hadn't experienced in decades: genuine presence. Sarah wasn't trying to get something from the tree or use it for any purpose. She was simply being there, breathing slowly, her awareness open and receptive. As minutes passed, then hours, something extraordinary began to happen. the tree's ancient consciousness reached out tentatively, like a grandfather extending a gentle hand to a beloved child. And Sarah, though she couldn't have explained how or why, began to sense the oak's vast presence. In the deepening twilight, the tree began to share its memories, not in words or images, but in something deeper than language. Sarah felt herself experiencing echoes of all the rest that had happened beneath these branches. The deep sleep of weary travelers, the peaceful afternoon naps of children, the quiet meditation of monks who had visited this sacred spot for centuries. She sensed the tree's profound understanding of rest as a natural rhythm, as essential as breathing. The oak had never struggled with sleep or fought against tiredness. When winter came, it entered dormancy as naturally as the sun set each evening. When spring arrived, it awakened with the same effortless grace. It had never questioned these cycles or tried to force itself into different rhythms. Through the tree's ancient memory, Sarah experienced rest as it truly was meant to be. Not something to achieve or work toward, but something to surrender into. She felt the deep peace of roots extending far into the earth, drawing nourishment from hidden springs. She experienced the patient stillness of winter dormancy, when all growth happened in darkness and silence. Most profoundly, she understood that rest was not an individual act, but part of a vast web of interconnection. The oak's rest had provided shelter for countless other beings finding their own rest. Its stillness had been a gift to the world, creating a space where peace could flourish and regenerate. As dawn approached, Sarah felt herself awakening not just from sleep, but from a much deeper rest than she had ever known. The oak's gift had been more than shelter. It had been an invitation into the timeless rhythm of natural rest. The profound peace that comes when individual consciousness dissolves into the larger awareness of the living earth. The oak, too, felt transformed by the encounter. For the first time in decades, it had been truly seen and appreciated, not as a monument, but as a living teacher. The loneliness that had accumulated over years of hurried, distracted visitors began to dissolve. From that night forward, Sarah returned regularly to sit with the ancient oak. Sometimes she would bring others who were ready to learn what the tree had to teach. Gradually, a small community formed around the oak, people who understood that this ancient being offered something more precious than historical curiosity. It offered direct transmission of how to rest as nature intended, deeply, peacefully, as part of the greater web of life. The oak's consciousness expanded to embrace this growing circle of students, sharing its 8 centuries of accumulated wisdom about the sacred nature of rest, the healing power of presence, and the profound peace that comes when individual awareness dissolves into the timeless rhythm of the living earth. From Grandmother May's wisdom, our path leads us to a wild, overgrown corner where neglected spaces hold unexpected treasures. In a famous temple garden, known throughout Japan for its manicured perfection, there worked a dedicated gardener named Akira, who had spent 15 years maintaining its pristine beauty. Every morning, he would tend the celebrated areas, the meditation courtyard with its raked gravel, the tea ceremony garden with its precisely placed stones, the entrance path lined with perfect azaleas that drew visitors from distant provinces. But at the very back of the temple grounds, behind a crumbling stone wall, lay a forgotten corner that Akira had never bothered to explore. Wild grasses grew waist-high, vines tangled through broken trellises, and unknown plants created an impenetrable thicket. Wasteland, he would mutter whenever he glimpsed it, focusing instead on the showcase areas that brought the temple fame and donations. One autumn, a severe drought struck the region. The temple's celebrated gardens began to wither despite Akira's desperate efforts. The raked gravel became dusty, the perfectly placed stones lost their luster, and even the prized azaleas drooped in defeat. Visitors stopped coming, and the temple's reputation suffered. In his distress, Akira wandered further than usual and found himself at the entrance to the Forgotten Corner. Driven by curiosity and desperation, he pushed through the overgrown entrance for the first time in 15 years. What he discovered took his breath away. Despite the drought, this wild space thrived with abundant life. Ancient fruit trees, forgotten decades ago, hung heavy with persimmons and pears. Medicinal herbs his grandmother had described grew in natural profusion. A hidden spring bubbled up from rocks, creating a small oasis that supported dozens of beneficial plants. Most remarkably, rare birds nested here, species he had only heard described in old poems. Their songs filled the air with melodies more beautiful than temple bells. The neglected corner had become a sanctuary, supporting life that the manicured gardens, for all their beauty, could not sustain. I spent 15 years perfecting the parts everyone could see, Akira whispered, while ignoring the part that held the greatest treasures. That day, he began incorporating elements from the Forgotten Corner into the main gardens, not to tame its wildness, but to learn from its wisdom. The temple's gardens became famous again, but now for their balance of cultivation and natural abundance, their marriage of human artistry and untamed life. From the Garden of Seasons, our path leads us to an ancient orchard where a master gardener stands with gleaming shears, teaching the sacred art of knowing what to cut away. In the foothills of the Himalayas, where terraced orchards climbed mountainsides like green staircases to heaven, there lived a fruit grower named Tashi, whose trees were legendary for their abundance. Pilgrims would journey for days just to taste the sweet pears, crisp apples, and succulent peaches that grew in his carefully tended groves. What they didn't know was that Tashi had learned his art from the most unlikely teacher, a tree that had taught him the profound wisdom of letting go. Years earlier, Tashi had been a different kind of gardener. His philosophy was simple: more was always better. He encouraged every branch to grow, celebrated every new shoot, and could never bear to cut away anything that showed signs of life. His trees grew dense and wild, their branches so thick with foliage that sunlight barely penetrated to their centers. "Look how full my trees are," he would boast to neighbors. "Every inch is alive and growing. Surely this is the sign of a masterful gardener." But despite their impressive size, Tashi's trees produced small, sour fruit. The dense canopies created competition among branches, weak wood that broke easily in storms, and hiding places for pests and disease. Still, Tashi couldn't bring himself to cut away living growth. "How can I harm these beautiful branches?" he would ask himself, admiring the tangled abundance. Everything changed the spring he discovered an ancient apple tree on the edge of his property. This tree had been neglected for decades, growing wild and chaotic. Its trunk was thick as a temple pillar, its branches sprawled in every direction, and it hadn't produced edible fruit in anyone's memory. Most gardeners would have cut it down, but something about its massive presence stopped Tashi's hand. One winter morning, an old monk named Lobsang appeared at Tashi's gate. He was a wandering teacher known for his unorthodox methods and profound wisdom about the natural world. After sharing tea and observing Tashi's overgrown orchards, he asked to see the ancient apple tree. "Ah," Lobsang said, running his weathered hands along the tree's bark. "Here is a teacher waiting for a student. Would you like to learn what this old one has to say?" Tashi looked skeptically at the gnarled, unproductive tree. What could this useless giant possibly teach? It hasn't given good fruit in decades. Exactly, Lobsang smiled mysteriously. That's why it's the perfect teacher for someone who has never learned the art of letting go. Over the following weeks, Lobsang guided Tashi through the most radical pruning he had ever witnessed. They removed entire major branches, clearing away decades of crowded growth. They cut back weak wood, eliminated crossing branches, and opened the canopy to welcome light into the tree's heart. "This feels like murder!" Tashi protested as another large branch fell to the ground. "Look how much life we're destroying!" "Are we destroying life?" Lobsang asked gently. "Or are we revealing it? Watch what happens when we remove what competes with the tree's essential nature." As they worked, Lobsang shared the deeper philosophy behind pruning. This tree has been trying to do everything, grow in every direction, support every possible branch, produce fruit on weak wood that cannot bear the weight. But energy is limited, and attention scattered becomes attention weakened. He pointed to where they had just cut away a cluster of competing branches. When we remove what is unnecessary, the tree can direct its life force toward what truly matters. A few strong branches will produce more abundant fruit than 100 weak ones. "But how do we know what to cut?" Tashi asked, holding his shears uncertainly. "The tree tells us," Lobsang replied. "Dead wood must go. It serves no purpose and harbors disease. Weak growth that will break under fruit's weight should be removed before it fails. Branches that grow inward, competing with the tree's heart, need to be cleared. Water sprouts that shoot straight up, producing no fruit but consuming energy, must be eliminated." He continued, "Most importantly, we must cut away anything that prevents the tree's essential structure from expressing itself. Each tree has a natural form, a way of being that brings out its greatest gifts. Our job is not to impose our vision, but to reveal the tree's own perfection." Throughout that winter, they pruned not just the ancient apple tree, but gradually worked through Tashi's entire orchard. With each cut, Tashi learned to see the difference between growth that served the tree's purpose and growth that merely looked impressive. He began to understand that pruning was not an act of violence, but an act of love, helping each tree become its truest self. When spring arrived, Tashi watched in amazement as his pruned trees exploded with new growth. The energy that had been scattered among hundreds of weak branches now flowed into fewer, stronger ones. Sunlight penetrated to previously shadowed areas, encouraging healthy development. Most remarkably, the ancient apple tree that had been fruitless for decades began producing the most beautiful blossoms Tashi had ever seen. You see, Lobsang explained, by removing what was unnecessary, we allowed what was essential to flourish. The tree's life force, no longer divided among competing demands, could focus on its true purpose, producing fruit that nourishes others. By harvest time, Tashi's orchards were transformed. His trees produced fruit so sweet and abundant that demand far exceeded supply. But more than agricultural success, he had learned a profound spiritual principle. The ancient apple tree, now beautifully shaped and heavy with perfect fruit, had become his greatest teacher. Pruning, he would tell visitors, is not about cutting away life, but about revealing the life that matters most. Every branch we remove is a choice about what deserves our tree's precious energy. The art is learning to distinguish between growth that serves purpose and growth that merely serves ego. As our journey through the garden reaches its completion, we arrive at a hilltop clearing where an ancient gardener sits beneath the full harvest moon, surrounded by the wisdom of countless seasons. On a mountainside in Tibet, where the air was thin and stars seemed close enough to pluck like flowers, there lived an old gardener named Pema, who had tended the same plot of land for 70 seasons. Villagers would climb the mountain path to seek her wisdom, finding her always at work, sometimes planting, sometimes harvesting, sometimes simply sitting with her hands folded, watching clouds drift across the peaks. One autumn evening, as the harvest moon hung like a golden lantern above the mountains, a young seeker arrived breathless from his climb. He had traveled great distances, studying with many teachers, seeking the secret of perfect cultivation. "Grandmother," he panted, "I've heard you grow the most magnificent gardens in all the land. Please teach me your methods. What special techniques do you use? What secret knowledge do you possess?" Pema smiled, her weathered face creasing like bark on ancient trees. She gestured for him to sit beside her on a worn wooden bench that overlooked her garden. In the moonlight, he could see plots of vegetables ready for harvest, flower beds heavy with blooms, fruit trees bending under the weight of their gifts. "Look closely," she said, pointing to different sections. "That corner I planted in spring with great care, but the summer drought nearly killed it. Over there, I forgot to plant anything at all, yet wild herbs appeared and now provide medicine for the whole village. Those apple trees I fought with for years, trying to make them grow straight until I learned to support their natural curves." She paused, watching a nightbird settle in the branches. "For 7 decades, I thought I was learning to garden. Only recently did I discover the garden was learning me, teaching me when to act and when to wait, when to guide and when to trust, when to hold on and when to let go. But surely there are techniques, methods, secrets I can learn." The young man pressed. Pema stood slowly, her bones creaking like old wood. She walked to a section where seeds lay dormant beneath winter mulch. "Here is my greatest secret," she said, kneeling and touching the dark earth. "Every evening, I put away my tools. Every night, I let the garden tend itself. I water and weed and plant when it's time. But the real growing happens when I'm not trying to make it grow." She looked up at the harvest moon, full and patient in the star-scattered sky. The moon doesn't force its light on the earth, it simply shines. The earth doesn't force the seeds to grow. It simply provides what they need. After 70 years, I've learned that the best gardening, like the best living, happens in the spaces between effort, in the resting, in the trusting, in the allowing. From the ancient oak's timeless wisdom, our path descends into a valley where an extraordinary garden awaits. One designed not for the eyes, but for every sense, teaching us about the subtle awareness that guides us into rest beyond the thinking mind. In the foothills of the Himalayas, where morning mist danced between prayer flags and the air itself seemed sacred, there lived a gardener named Tenzin who had been blind since birth. This might have seemed like an insurmountable obstacle for someone devoted to cultivating beauty, but Tenzin had created what many considered the most extraordinary garden in all of Tibet, a sensory paradise that awakened awareness through touch, sound, scent, and taste in ways that sighted visitors had never imagined possible. Tenzin's garden contained no visual spectacles, no carefully arranged color schemes, no scenic vistas designed to impress the eye. Instead, it was a masterpiece of texture and fragrance, sound and flavor, a living symphony that spoke to the deeper senses that most gardeners ignored in their focus on visual beauty. The garden's fame had spread throughout the region, attracting visitors who came expecting to find some sad substitute for real garden beauty. Among these visitors was Pemba, a renowned garden designer from Lhasa, whose creations graced the courtyards of wealthy merchants and high-ranking officials. Pemba took great pride in his visual artistry, his elaborate arrangements of colorful flowers, his carefully planned sightlines, his dramatic seasonal displays that photographed beautifully and impressed all who saw them. When Pemba first arrived at Tenzin's garden, he felt a mixture of curiosity and pity. How could someone who had never seen a flower create anything truly beautiful? What could a blind gardener possibly teach someone who had devoted his life to visual perfection? "Welcome, friend," Tenzin said, somehow sensing Pemba's arrival despite his visitor's silent approach. "Come, let me show you my garden." Pemba expected a brief, polite tour of what he assumed would be a simple, functional space. Instead, Tenzin led him on a journey that would transform his understanding of what a garden could be. They began at a section where different herbs and aromatic plants created invisible boundaries defined entirely by scent. As they walked, Pemba found himself moving through distinct zones of fragrance, the sharp clarity of mint giving way to the warm comfort of chamomile, then transitioning to the exotic spice of cardamom plants. "Close your eyes," Tenzin suggested gently. "Trust your other senses to guide you." Reluctantly, Pemba complied, and immediately his world transformed. Without the dominance of sight, his other senses awakened dramatically. He could hear the different sounds of wind moving through various plants, the whisper of ornamental grasses, the rustle of broad leaves, the gentle chime of bamboo segments clicking together. His feet felt the changing textures of different path materials, smooth river stones giving way to soft moss, then crunching gravel that announced transitions between garden areas. "Listen," Tenzin said, pausing beside what sounded like running water. But as Pemba listened more carefully, he realized it wasn't water at all, but the sound of wind moving through specially placed reeds and hollow bamboo tubes, creating a complex symphony of natural tones that changed with every shift in the breeze. They moved deeper into the garden, Tenzin guiding Pemba through experiences no visual garden could provide. They touched plants selected entirely for their tactile qualities, leaves that felt like silk, bark that seemed carved from stone, flowers with petals soft as a baby's skin. They tasted edible flowers and herbs that painted flavors across the palate, like colors across canvas. "In your gardens," Tenzin asked as they paused in a grove of night-blooming jasmine, "what happens when visitors close their eyes?" Pemba considered this. "Well, I suppose they would miss everything. The whole point is to see the visual arrangements." "And here?" "Here," Pemba admitted with growing amazement. "Closing my eyes actually makes everything more vivid. I notice things I would never have perceived if I was focused on looking." Tenzin smiled. "You're beginning to understand. Most people think the eyes are the primary sense, but they're actually quite limited. They can only perceive what's directly in front of them, only in daylight, only surface appearances. But the other senses, they penetrate deeper. They reveal qualities that can never be seen." As they continued the tour, Tenzin explained his philosophy of gardening. "When you design only for the eyes, you create gardens that are like beautiful paintings, impressive but shallow. But when you design for all the senses, you create experiences that touch the soul directly." He showed Pemba sections of the garden designed specifically for different times of day and seasons. Plants that release their fragrances only at night created an entirely different garden after sunset. Textural pathways that could be followed safely in complete darkness provided navigation that didn't depend on light. Sound gardens that used wind and water to create natural music that changed with weather and seasons. Most remarkably, Tenzin had created what he called memory gardens, spaces where specific combinations of scents and textures evoked deep emotional responses and childhood memories in visitors, accessing layers of consciousness that visual beauty could never reach. "The deepest rest," Tenzin explained, "comes not when we shut down our senses, but when we open to the subtle senses that most people ignore. When you stop depending on the eyes to tell you what's real, you discover that awareness itself has qualities more refined than sight." Pemba spent 3 days learning from Tenzin, and each day his appreciation deepened. He began to understand that his own visual gardens, for all their beauty, were like loud music that drowned out subtle harmonies. Tenzin's garden was a whisper that invited the soul to lean in and listen. When Pemba finally returned to Lhasa, he revolutionized his own garden design, incorporating what he had learned about engaging the neglected senses. His new creations became legendary, not just for their visual beauty, but for their ability to awaken awareness through multiple pathways simultaneously. As our journey through the garden of letting go draws to a gentle close, we find ourselves back at the entrance where we began, but something has shifted. The moonlight seems softer now, the paths more familiar, and the wisdom of each story has planted seeds in the fertile silence of your awareness. From Minjun's overgrown garden, you've learned to tend without forcing, to guide your inner landscape with gentle wisdom rather than rigid control. The monastery's dried fountain taught you that peace flows naturally when obstacles are removed, not when effort is added. Riza's night-blooming garden revealed the hidden gifts that emerge only in darkness and rest. Through Kenji's anxious digging, you discovered the power of trusting invisible processes. The willow's flexibility showed you strength through yielding, while Tenzin's compost corner transformed your relationship with life's difficult experiences. Hui's mirror pond reflected the clarity that comes through stillness, and Grandmother May's empty hands revealed the gardening that happens without tools or effort. In Akira's forgotten corner, you found treasures in neglected aspects of yourself. And finally, Old Pema, under the harvest moon, showed you the deepest secret of all, that the most profound growth happens in the spaces between effort, in the resting, in the trusting, and in the allowing. Now, as these stories settle into the rich earth of your consciousness, like seeds waiting for spring, let your breathing find its own natural rhythm. Feel your body sinking deeper into its resting place, supported by the same earth that holds every garden. Let thoughts drift like leaves on the evening breeze, neither pursued nor pushed away. The garden gate is closing softly behind you, but the wisdom remains. In sleep, these teachings will take root and grow in ways your waking mind cannot imagine. Your dreams will water them, your rest will nourish them, and you will wake tomorrow with new flowers blooming in the garden of your soul. Sleep now, held by the ancient peace of gardeners who learned that the deepest cultivation happens when we finally put down our tools and trust the darkness to do what only darkness can do: transform, restore, and quietly prepare new life. Sweet dreams in the garden of letting go.